Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to this conversation at the Lowy Institute about Donald Trump and the West. I'm Michael Fullilove, the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute, and I'm joined today direct from Washington, D.C. by Dr. John Hamre, President and Chief Executive of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ladies and gentlemen, later this month, a group of the world's most powerful leaders, including President Trump and Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, will gather in Kananaskis, Canada for the G7 summit. And I think that the chimes in Dr. Hamre's office were telling us that that news is coming through. No problem. The G7 is the institutional embodiment of the global West, the group of rich liberal democracies with historical ties to the United States. It used to be referred to as the steering committee of the global economy when it represented a much larger proportion of global output. Of course, the United States is the keystone of the West. Without US leadership, none of the great challenges facing humanity will be solved. So we decided that this would be a timely opportunity to talk about President Trump's relations with the West. But of course, Mr. Trump is the great disruptor, and this morning we woke up to the news that his administration has launched a 30-day review into AUKUS, the agreement under which Australia will acquire between 3 and 5 Virginia-class subs from the United States in the early 2030s, and then build 5 SSN AUKUS-class submarines, which are due to come into service in the early 2040s. So this morning, just as the administration has pivoted, the Institute is going to pivot, and the first part of today's conversation will explore that news in depth, and then we'll come back to the broader story of Donald Trump's relations with the West, of which AUKUS, of course, is a part. So it's very good timing for us that today we are joined by one of the wisest and most sagacious Washington observers, Dr. John Hamre, President and CEO of the Center for Strategic International Studies. John and I were joking last week that in Australia we have unusual creatures like the platypus with the bill of a duck, the tail of a beaver, and the feet of an otter, through American eyes, that is. And John is a bit of a political platypus because during his career in the US government, he served in senior roles under a number of Democratic administrations, despite being a registered Republican. He is known as a fiercely impartial and highly analytical Washington observer. So, John Hamre, thank you very much for joining us from CSIS.
Well, my wife would love knowing that I was a platypus. I mean, I think that's a fitting way to start. Thank you, Michael. Delighted to be with you.
I can see your tail waving in the back of the truck there. All right, John, let's kick off with the breaking news. As first reported in the FT, the United States is launching a 30-day review into the AUKUS partnership, and in a statement from the Pentagon, officials said they want to ensure the highest readiness of American service members. They want to ensure that allies step up fully to do their part for collective defense, and that the US defense industrial base is meeting its needs. In other words, they said they want to ensure that AUKUS meets these common sense America first criteria. The review will be led by the new Undersecretary of Defense, Elbridge Colby, who's previously been skeptical of the AUKUS program, and he has said on occasions that unless Washington can accelerate submarine production, then providing these subs to Australia would leave the United States vulnerable. So let me ask you first, John, you've spent a lot of time in the Pentagon in your career. What do you make of this review? What is its purpose? What's the likely outcome?
Well, this is a rather typical thing. I think there are 3 things that are fed into this. And by the way, I don't know very much about it. I, like you, have been trying to figure out what I can here, getting ready. I mean, first, every administration questions the decisions of their predecessor. I mean, and it's become a common problem now in America where, every administration thinks the predecessor was a dope and they've got to change what they inherited. And so partly it's that. So that's part of it. I think part of it is a it's a deep question that's been playing through all of this, and that is America is struggling to produce submarines. We're having difficulty producing submarines. It wasn't caused by Australia. Totally apart from AUKUS, we would have difficulty manufacturing submarines. Um, it is when COVID hit, we lost much of the labor force out at Groton, where we manufacture the big parts of the subway. So there has been an undertow of concern coming from the Navy, honestly, that that AUKUS is going to make it hard for the Navy to get its own ships. So that's the second thing. I think the third thing is partly Rich Colby. I mean, he's a he's a more important voice. Normally, undersecretaries for policy are not dominant voices in an administration, but what's happening. Normally administrations, when they come into office, every succeeding month they get deeper and stronger. This administration is getting shallower with every succeeding month. I mean, they got rid of the National Security Council staff. They're cutting the State Department in half. They're making their base shallower, and that makes the Undersecretary for Policy a stronger voice than normally you would hear. And Rich is he's rather monodimensional, and it's all about fighting a war with China. And if there are any resources that are to something other than fighting a war against China, he's not for it. So I think those are the three factors that are behind this. Honestly, I'm not terribly worried about this review. I mean, Australia has very high standing, in the U.S. political and security establishment. A review will be constructive. The issue associated with the manufacturing base here is real. But Australia doesn't make it worse than it is right now. And, we have a problem right now. We got to fix that. So I don't think getting rid of AUKUS would solve the problem that is motivating part of his concern. So, we'll go through it. I think it's a useful thing to do. I'm not particularly apprehensive about how this will work out.
All right, let me suggest another possible motivation for this review that's certainly getting a lot of speculation in the press, and that is to create more leverage to encourage Australia to spend more on defence and or to contribute more to the defence industrial base that you mentioned. And to provide you just with some background, as you know, Australian defence spending is stuck at 2%. This government has promised to get it to 2.4% by 2034. When Pete Hegseth, the Defence Secretary, met with the Australian Defence Minister Richard Marles last week, he encouraged Australia to get to 3.5%. A lot of America's allies are, bending the curve northwards in a way that the Australian government hasn't said it will do yet. So is it just coincidence, do you think, that this review has been announced prior to a likely meeting between Mr. Albanese and Trump at Kananaskis? Is this a way of creating leverage to get greater contributions from Australia on those two fronts, do you think?
That could be part of, the dynamic that was going on inside the administration. I think there is a general perception, forgive me for saying it this way, that, the Albanese government has been supportive of AUKUS, but not really leaning in on AUKUS. I think that's felt, more widely here, than people realize. Look, this administration has been pressuring all allies to do more. I mean, and so Australia's had a solid defense program here.
it hasn't been at the very top of the GDP on a GDP basis, but
Well, I think it's pretty solid, and by the way, the establishment, the structure of the security community here is very pro-Australia. That's not an issue, but I think you are getting the kind of the general backdrop of, of Trump's personality and wanting to just lean on allies, to do more, and so I think it could be part of it. Do I think that's going to be a major factor? Um, no, I don't really. I think AUKUS will stand on its own. There's a logic that's structural that will, I think, stand on its own. It will take more people than Bridge Colby, to be reviewing this. He's a capable young man, but he's limited, and so this is a little bit beyond, I think his uh, field of view. This is a structural issue.
I'm going to stick with AUKUS for a minute, but let me ask you, in light of what you've just said to us, which is very interesting, which is you've said that there's a perception in Washington that may not be fully understood in Australia, that the Albanese government has supported AUKUS but hasn't really leaned into AUKUS. In light of that, what would be your advice to Mr. Albanese if and when he meets with Mr. Trump? Meeting with Mr. Trump as a foreign leader is a fraught experience, as President Zelensky and President Ramaphosa found. Other Western leaders have settled on this approach where they try to do something special for Mr. Trump in the form of, the framed birth certificate of his grandfather from the German Chancellor, the engraved invitation from King Charles when Keir Starmer joined, and then so they flatter him and then try to point him in the direction that they want to go. Given all this swirling around, how would you suggest Mr. Albanese prepares for that meeting with Donald Trump? Would it make sense, for example, to pull a big rabbit out of the hat on funding? On defense funding, how would you approach it if you were advising President and Prime Minister Albanese?
Well, I mean, let me just say, this is only my personal formulation, but I think, President Trump brings to his presidency his life experiences as a developer of physical property, real property. So I think he looks at Russia and China as the zoning commission of Atlantic City, and he wants a bigger hotel, and he's going to do what it takes to get a bigger hotel. He's going to charm them, threaten them, wine them, dine them, that sort of thing. I think he views allies as subcontractors, and he basically he's needed subcontractors. No developer can build anything without subcontractors, but he's always cheated them and abused them. So, and I think he views allies as subcontractors. Um, so when I talk with dear friends in allied countries, I always tell them, don't try to make the great emperor happy by offering trophies. Become the best, strongest subcontractor you can be. Just be strong. And that means, invest in your own security, invest in your own diplomacy, bring to the table things that they don't have, but don't make it a peace offering. Just be a strong ally. And, when you're a strong subcontractor, he's going to keep coming back to you.
Okay, so I'm just visualizing this. Australia is the subby, as the best, most reliable subby. What you're saying is we've got to be good on the product that we deliver and good on price, I guess, as well.
That's right. I mean, but it's good on performance. I mean, what do you bring to the table that America needs? And right now, I mean, look, I think that the complexity that Australia faces, is trying to figure out what the hell are we trying to do with China? Okay. And I don't personally think that President Trump has a strategic goal. He doesn't have goals, he has tactics. And I think he's maneuvering to try to figure out how to get leverage over China, and then he's going to figure out, what do I get out of it? Okay. I think he hadn't anticipated that China had mapped out him more closely than he had mapped out them. And he's now confronting that. And so again, I'd say, for Australia, what you should be doing is, just do what's in your own national interest and be good at it and lean in on it. Don't don't try to create a special agenda that is designed for the American president. Focus on what makes sense, what you bring to the table, how strong you can be. You've got a competent defense establishment. You know Southeast Asia better than we do. So you bring things to the table, and you should focus on, what are your core strengths?
All right, one more question on AUKUS, and then I'll broaden it out to the topic of our discussion, that is Donald Trump and the West. And let me give you an exclusive, John, and let me give the audience an exclusive. On Monday, we will release the Lowy Institute poll, but in light of today's AUKUS news, we thought we'd pre-release one result that is particularly interesting, and that is what Australians think about nuclear-powered submarines. And the poll that will come out on Monday shows that 67% of Australians, that's 2/3 of Australians, continue to favour acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. And that number has held firm over the 4 years since the deal was announced. I think it was 70% when it was announced 4 years ago, 67% now, so very close. 2/3 support nuclear-powered subs. That's a very high number when you're asking about especially such an expensive capability. So, John, my question to you is, you've said you feel pretty confident that they won't kill AUKUS, that they'll review it, that this is a good thing to do. But let's jump to the worst case scenario. If Donald Trump were to decide that this was a bad deal, this was a stupid deal that his predecessor launched into, if he were to kill it or to drive up the price in such a way that it fell away, what do you think would be the impact on the alliance with Australia, but also more broadly allied perceptions of US reliability if the US were to step away from such a big, considered, important arrangement?
Well, the first rule a politician has is never answer a hypothetical, and I'm not a politician, but I'm smart enough not to answer a hypothetical. Let me just, but to try to address your question, it's a fair question. You know, Trump has been very pugnacious about NATO, but he's made it clear he's not pulling out of NATO. And I think that the establishment that's around President Trump, the National Security Advisor, well, that's now the same as the Secretary of State. They do feel that China presents the most challenging security problem. And that's going to be the narrative that goes into the administration. They're going to naturally see that Australia is an asset, not a liability. So I think, again, I just think Australia ought to engage with us in just the way you always have. You just engaged us directly at almost every level in a very straightforward conversation, and I think that's been constructive. Now, is it in Australia's interest to have nuclear submarines? That's
That's a fair question. I personally think that's been answered, but it's a fair question, to raise. And there are two dimensions to it, and that is, what is organic to Australia's national interests where a nuclear submarine makes a contribution. And the second is where does Australia's partnership with the United States in a federated activity constitute a vital national interest? I think the nuclear program answers yes to both of those questions. You have a vast theater. You need to operate in ways that constitute credible deterrence. Yeah, there's I don't want to frame China as this ominous, dangerous threat. I don't personally think it's like that. But it needs to know that Australia will fight back in a way that's meaningful. I think the AUKUS program really is a profoundly important contribution to that. And so I think, again, you guys need to have a robust conversation where you look at both dimensions. You're looking at the dimension of the submarines, offering an organic structure of deterrence that's important to Australia, and then the way in which AUKUS is a part of a federated effort when you're involved in a larger dimension of security and deterrence. And I think that it's clearly a yes on both of those counts. Now, I think your public they basically understand that. I think they understand that. But that's because there's been really good, strong leadership from the top that has explained why it's important. And and I do think it has been, and I do think the Albanese government has been supportive of AUKUS, but they need to lean more into AUKUS. And I think that's the one thing I would recommend, that you want to come to Washington in a way where you are a stronger ally, not somebody who is seen as a weak partner who's a supplicant and riding on American security. I personally reject that argument about Australia, about most of our allies, frankly. But we've got politicians that look at this rather superficially, and frankly, defense spending per GDP is part of that. So, but you should address it on your own. You live in a more complicated world. You had Chinese, combatants circumnavigating Australia. Okay, that was a signal. Okay, that was a signal. You need to be able to demonstrate that you're not intimidated by that. And I think AUKUS is one of the best ways to show that.
All right. We've dealt with the Donald disruption. Let me broaden the conversation, go back to the conversation we intended to have about Mr. Trump and the West more broadly. And it seems to me that it's perhaps Western countries who are most discombobulated by Donald Trump, because America's adversaries, you indicated that, it feels like both China and Russia have a reasonably good handle on President Trump. They're accustomed to dealing with fellow strongmen. For leaders in the Gulf, in parts of Asia, similarly, Mr. Trump is not a completely unfamiliar figure at the top of a government. It's really for Western countries with long democratic traditions, with certain expectations about how democratic leaders behave, who find Mr. Trump perhaps the most challenging, in part because his impulses run counter to our instincts. He is skeptical of alliances, as you've said, whereas most Western leaders believe in alliances. He seems to have an affinity for autocrats. He enjoys dealing with autocrats. He loves the flag waving and the hair waving and so on when he's in the Gulf, whereas Western countries are democracies and free societies. He is hostile to free trade, whereas most Western leaders believe in free trade. So I think this is why the West finds Mr. Trump a bit discombobulating. So let me ask you, what do you think Mr. Trump thinks about the West? President Biden would often say that foreign policy was about a contest between democracy and autocracy. Does Mr. Trump believe that? Does he see himself as the leader of the free world?
We're used to 70 years of people who have been in public life in government as being leaders in the country. Donald Trump, he's a private figure from the business world, ran an eponymous private company. He had total discretion over what he did. He had no board of directors. He wasn't accountable to anybody. He was only accountable to people that loaned him money. That didn't go well for Deutsche Bank. And so he comes to public life with an unusual, background. I think his life experiences have always been the government's in my way and how do I get around them, and now he's running the government. So he's not inclined to think about, the structure of an international order. He's not inclined to think about, the structural dimensions of deterrence. He's not inclined to think about the structural nature of forward deployed forces and the role they play in a defense posture. He's quite it's his life experience. I mean, not and look, he was elected president twice, but he just doesn't have the background that we're familiar with in a traditional American leader. And so it is structurally unusual. But he's the head of a government, and he has to make the government work. Now, I think this is an unusual time. The last time we had a president who was elected and then defeated and then elected was Grover Cleveland. Okay, that was 125 years ago. We don't have any modern experience with somebody that has that kind of background. And so he's very energized and feels he has a real mandate. And he does, in a sense. I mean, he was defeated and then reelected. I mean, he has a real mandate. And so he feels empowered, but he also feels that the standing government is hostile to him and he can't trust it. So he's taking steps that is making the federal government shallower. It's not deeper. Most presidents, the longer they go, the deeper the government becomes. He's taking steps that makes it shallower and shallower and shallower. And so he's done away with the National Security Council. He's proposed to cut the State Department by 80%. I think that's more of a game than anything, but nonetheless, very, very deep cuts. He's put somebody in charge of the Defense Department that has become very isolated and alone, and not really running the department. And so his administration is becoming shallower, and it's becoming more responsive to him. Okay. Now, so the reality is for the next 3.5 years, allies have to deal with this president. Okay. And there's no way around that. No, he's not going to be impeached. He's not going to be removed. I mean, he's going to be there, but it's going to become a less structured, less predictable American government.
It's going to be a bit more spontaneous and uncertain. And the question is, when do there are a number of external constraints that ultimately will come around him, but they aren't there now. And allies just have to think about how they deal with that. He's not a student of international structural theory. He's not a student of Hans Morgenthau. He's not a student of Ramon. He is he's his own person and very confident in his own judgment, but his life experiences have been very transactional, and unfortunately, he's making the structure around him more shallow. So I think allies have to understand it's going to be kind of a choppy 3 years. It may, things may change a bit next year if they lose control of the House, but it's going to become more choppy. And so this is why I come back again to my central recommendation. Don't go to an international venue to try to offer beautiful trophies for the emperor. Become the strongest ally that we have. Do things that are important for yourself. Strengthen your diplomacy, strengthen your defense. Be a strong ally that he needs. Don't try to be a supplicant that gives him something.
I think that advice is well taken. What you've said, though, is that as the US government becomes shallower, it becomes more personalized, more responsive to his beliefs and impulses. So to go back to my question, what do you think, does democracy versus autocracy mean much to President Trump? Would he recognize himself as the leader of the free world, or would he recognize himself as a big beast in Atlantic City trying to maximize his profit, for example?
I think he thinks of himself as the leader of a powerful country that has to figure out how to structure a framework with China and with Russia. I don't think he thinks in terms of being the leader of a free world. I don't think that's in his background. And I think he hears words like that and he thinks that's what Joe Biden did. And Joe Biden was weak. I'm strong. We're not like that. So I don't think that's in his worldview. As I said, I don't think he has a structural understanding of international relations or of alliances. I think he has a transactional perspective on how he has to work with people that matter to him, and it's very clear China matters to him. It's also very clear that he went into this tariff war without having a strategy. And so he's now wrestling with all of that.
Let me come to the G7 meeting in Kananaskis. The last time the G7 summit took place in Canada was 2018 in Quebec. And you might remember the viral photo from that G7 meeting of President Trump, a seated President Trump with his arms folded, surrounded by Merkel and Trudeau and other leaders, very much looking like they were at odds. Now the G7 is coming back to Canada, which of course is a country that on which Mr. Trump has designs as potentially as the 51st state. So two questions. First of all, what do you think the vibes will be out of the G7 meeting? Will it be back to Quebec or will it be something different? And secondly, what on earth is happening with US-Canadian relations?
Well, the Canadians, as the secretariat for this meeting of the G7, have already announced there will be no leader's statement. Okay, they've already decided, let's not try to do that.
And I think that that probably is wise. This administration does not have the structure in place to work through to a consensus statement on a major conference. I mean, as I say, they're becoming shallower. I mean, they just are losing, the bureaucratic depth to be able to manage that. So I think that the Canadians and the other G7 participants are they don't want Trump to avoid the meeting. They don't want him to boycott the meeting. They don't want him to condemn the meeting, but they don't think they can produce something of the past, and so they're not going to try. So I think that it indicates a pattern of international collaboration that it will emerge and will be present over the next 3.5 years, and that is we want America in the room. We're not going to make ourselves vulnerable to get a predictable outcome from them, and we're going to hold the overall structure together, and we'll just weather the storm. Now, when Mark Carney was here, he did quite well. I mean, I think that a lot of Trump's petulance, for the last G7 summit in Canada was very much grounded around his disdain, for Trudeau. I mean, to be candid, I
Governor
think
Trudeau.
I don't think he respected Trudeau, and then Trudeau misplayed a few things, honestly. Carney's not going to do that. Carney came down, had a good meeting with Trump, and when Trump said Canada should be part of the United States, Trump said, well, is the White House, Carney said, is the White House for sale? I'll buy the White House. Is it for sale? No, you're not going to sell the White House. We're not going to sell Canada. And Trump laughed, and that was the end of the conversation. So I think, Carney is a much more sophisticated, multidimensional guy. And I think you're going to see that this is going to be a good summit. It's not it won't be a summit that'll have historical echoes, but I do think it's going to be a good summit. CSIS, my think tank, we're championing the idea that we need to enlarge the G7. And our point of view on this is as follows. There are now 4 geopolitical tectonic plates, in the world. We've got the rule of law constituents, the G7, led by the G7. It's kind of the OECD countries. We have the authoritarian access, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, the authoritarian bloc. Then there is the global south, and they are too small to have agency, in the international sphere. And then the term that's emerged is something called connector states. I'm not sure that's a very good term, but it's countries that have agency and they don't want to be channeled into one bloc or the other. And so this is countries like, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, UAE, India, Indonesia, Brazil. They've got enough agency to pick and choose how they want to be involved. But the problem is that's the way the world is evolving. The UN is frozen, because of the structure of the UN. And so someplace there needs to be a venue for thoughtful governance on a global scale, and that should be the G7. But the problem with the G7 is it's Eurocentric. It's 4 of the members are European, but then they also invite permanently the European Union and the European Commission. So the table is Europe-centric. It needs to be broad, and it needs to be made more representative. And our view, CSIS, our view is that we should bring in Korea and Australia into broadening the base of the G7. So it is authentically more internationally representative as a governing, not a governing structure, but a coordinating structure. I think that this summit will make modest contributions to that. So, it's not going to produce, Donald Trump is not going to come and be, I don't think he's going to create a fit, but I don't think he's also going to be constructive, and they're not trying to make it that way. So I think the Canadian summit is going to be, it'll be useful for what it can be.
One other leader who's been invited to the G7 summit, although his country's not a member of the G7, is President Zelensky. So can I ask you when you squint your eyes on President Trump and the Russia-Ukraine war, what's his settling point, do you think? Because a while ago, it seemed like he was becoming much more critical of Russia. He said, I'm not happy. He said in April, I'm not happy with the Russian strikes on Kyiv. Vladimir, stop, he said on Truth Social. But then again, I noticed after Operation Spiderweb, the amazing Ukrainian operation where they sent drones to attack Russian air bases by loading them onto prefabricated homes and then popping the lids off. After that incident, President Trump spoke to President Putin, and I noticed that President Trump said, Vladimir Putin told me he would have to respond very strongly to this Ukrainian operation. But President Trump didn't say whether he'd urged him not to, or whether he'd urged him to moderate or not to attack civilians, for example. So what is Trump's settling point on Russia-Ukraine?
I think I don't think there is one. I think that his starting point was about where everybody else is, and that is, Russia can't win, but Ukraine isn't strong enough to push Russia out of Ukraine. I mean, I think that's fundamentally his starting point, and frankly, that's where most analysts are. And so the question is how do we bring this to some kind of a conclusion? And I think he felt, for whatever reason, I don't know all the details. I don't know. I think he felt that he could bring, a more subservient Ukraine to the table, and Russia would take that as a peace offering. That's not where Putin is. I mean, Putin is too invested in a narrative of his own making that isn't viable. And so this war was not going to end that way. This war will only end when, frankly, when Europe, NATO, creates a deterrent structure and brings it to cover Ukraine. And, Ukraine on its own cannot create a deterrent structure. Only NATO can do that. The Biden administration was too afraid of trying to do that. They didn't have that vision. They didn't have that courage. Trump doesn't understand that. It means that we would have to bring Ukraine into NATO quickly, but we'd also have to say to Ukraine, we're not going to help you recover the territories you lost. We're going to protect what you are now, but we're not going to help recover the territories you lost. And that would have been a gigantic sacrifice, for the Ukrainians too. And I don't know that they were prepared to make that. So unfortunately, we're drifting into a prolonged conflict. Now, just to say a word, Ukraine can hold its own. It's they've got almost 1 million people in arms. They're going to fabricate 4 million drones this year. They've got enough money in the bank to fight all through this year. Europe is starting to produce munitions directly and sending them to them so that it doesn't require so much American support. What America brings that is uniquely important is tactically relevant intelligence. And so far, we're providing that. The only time we cut that off was when Trump cut it off for 8 days, and those were the 8 days that the Russians pushed the Ukrainians out of the Kursk province. So our intelligence support is very important. But I think we'll continue to do that. And, the Russian army is seriously diminished. They cannot conduct operations above a company level now. Now they can put 20 company operations in field at the same time every day, but they can't do maneuver warfare. They've lost that. They cannot conduct operations at even a battalion level. You don't see them anymore. You only see company level operations, and they do the same dumb things day after day after day down the same road. It's just really, so it shows that their military is quite inept and not capable of a strategic win. So this is likely to drift into frozen conflict. And then the question, when does the economic price that the Russians pay become so great that they just back off a bit? The Ukrainians cannot back off until the Russians back off. The only thing that would get the Ukrainians to back off would be if we really weighed in and said, we'll give you NATO, but you got to agree to not fight over the territories you've lost. That won't happen. So I'm afraid this goes into a frozen conflict through this year.
All right, we've got about 10 minutes to go, and I want to see if I can take you through a couple of final issues before we finish. First of all, on China, you've mentioned China a couple of times. I have a question from the Institute's Senior Fellow for East Asia, Richard McGregor. It's a simple question. Has the Trump administration settled on a clear China policy, and does it have a plan to execute it?
No. That's the answer. I mean, no, they don't. President Trump, I don't think has a strategic view of China. I think he has a sense of tactics he wants to use for some purpose. Now, Bridge Colby and some of the people in the administration do have a very focused view, and that is they have to defeat China when China tries to invade Taiwan. And I think there are so many different problems associated with formulating it that way. So there are a few people in the administration that have that, but I wouldn't say that that's Trump's view. I don't think that is Trump's view.
All right, let me ask you a question from Andrew Caldor, who's associated with the Caldor Centre at the University of New South Wales. And this is really about the US, China, Australia strategic triangle. How does the Trump administration think about Australia's relationship with China? Is Washington likely to threaten Australia with tariffs or other penalties to push it to take action that might affect our relationship with Beijing, such as hosting US forces or diverting exports from China? So will the Trump administration punish Australia for having a close economic relationship with China, I guess, is another way of framing it.
Again, there are 3 rings in the circus here in Washington about economic policy. The center ring, of course, is President Trump, and it's about tariffs, but it's about finding some tactical advantage. It doesn't have a strategic design. It's about tactics. Then you have the second circle, and that's Secretary Bessent, and he has a very coherent theory. I happen to agree with it, that China has a domestic economic policy that is inherently predatory to the rest of the world, and that they're taking advantage of us, and we need to fight that. The problem that Bessent has is that America can't do that alone. We need to do that with allies, but with Trump's predilection on tariffs, we don't have allies on that issue. And then the third circle is around the chairman of the National Economic Advisors, and it is his agenda to weaken the dollar. It's his view that the dollar is too strong because it's a reserve currency, and we need to find a structural way to diminish the dollar's value vis-a-vis other currencies. He's using analogs back to the Plaza Accord for that. But there's no way for him to implement that because back in 1986, when we did the Plaza Accord, we could take 300,000 troops out of Europe. We don't have 300,000 troops in Europe anymore. Okay, there's no leverage like that. So there's no way for Stephen Mirren to get his agenda moving. These three agendas they fight against each other, okay? And so this thing isn't moving. Now, will Australia be punished because you have trying to find a working relationship with China? No. I mean, I think we feel, you went down that road, you learned your lesson, you now know that China can be predatory and you're smart to your own interests. I think that's the consensus in Washington. And I don't think that there's a feeling that we need to punish you because you're not doing stuff for us. Because Trump, by and large, I mean, look, Australia had prepared a complete package to give Donald Trump to stay out of the Liberation Day announcement. And Trump ignored it because he wanted you in just to be part of the big drama. And, so that's there, but it had nothing to do with your economic interaction with China.
All right. You've mentioned a lot of power players in the administration today. You've said that Mr. Trump is absolutely dominant, but you've mentioned these other different players. One name you haven't mentioned is the Vice President, J.D. Vance. What's your assessment of his vice presidency so far?
Well, the position of the vice president is very strange. It is the reason people want to be vice president is it is the most predictable way to become president, but it's not reliable to do that. But it has very little meaning to be the vice president. And so J.D. Vance is trying to find a way, like every vice president does, to be helpful to the president, not get in the way, and not make him mad at you. And so I think J.D. Vance is calibrating himself. He certainly wants to succeed Donald Trump. He can't do that if the Trump base voters think he's disloyal. So he has to be consistent and supportive of the base. And he has to try to find a way where he can make a contribution. So far, he's done that through being kind of the pit bull that's beside the owner that attacks whoever comes in the door. And but ultimately, that isn't what gets you elected, and it's hard to just develop an authentic, independent reputation when you're vice president because you don't control what your president does, but you inherit everything that happens. So I think he's being careful. He's trying to do what most vice presidents do, which is find some Lebensraum, how do I survive inside this posture? How do I be seen as supportive of the president? And how do I not damage my prospects when I run against, I run to try to succeed him? And that's a complicated landscape, for anybody. That was Joe Biden's problem. That was Kamala Harris's problem. That's every vice president's problem. It's a really tough position to be in.
All right, final question. I want to ask you about an issue of domestic policy that is getting an enormous amount of play, and that is the anti-deportation protests in Los Angeles, other parts of California, other parts of the United States. We saw these protests initially peaceful, then some violence. It seems like the Californian authorities were slow off the mark. Donald Trump, I guess, has certainly leaned into it, deploying National Guard and some other forces. How do you feel? How do you feel about how that issue is playing out at the moment, in particular the deployment of the Guard? And do you think in the end this will play in President Trump's favor or against him?
You know, on Saturday night, the chief of police in Los Angeles publicly said, "We can't control the city." That night, Gavin Newsom should have mobilized the Guard, and he didn't. And he gave a golden opportunity to Donald Trump to mobilize the Guard. Now, the president has authority to mobilize the Guard. The governor does too. I mean, it's a unique thing we have here. But it's emblematic of progressive Democrats that they're very ambivalent about the use of force. And he waffled. This is what happened up in Minnesota after the George Floyd riots, and the mayor up there in actually Twin Cities, or actually in St. Paul, waffled, and he couldn't figure out what to do, and he was weak. And at that time, the governor, Tim Walz, he also waffled. Democrats have a hard time understanding that there are times when Americans feel insecure and you need to do something. And so this was a big mistake by, for all practical purposes, Gavin Newsom ended any presidential prospect he had over this last weekend. Donald Trump will be the winner on this because when people see rioting in the streets, they personally feel insecure. They think about vulnerabilities in their own community, and they want security. And they think that Donald Trump stood up and brought that, and they thought Gavin Newsom waffled and failed. So this was a very large gift to Donald Trump. This was one of those silver platter things, put it right in front of him and let him decide how to enjoy it. It was a big mistake. Democrats have to understand that average citizens, they feel, when something like this happens, they feel great insecurity. And when we had the hurricane that went into New Orleans, and we had all these people stranded, Democrats saw them as victims. Republicans saw them as lawless. Okay, and that divide is there. And when Democrats don't realize when something like this happens in the street, Americans are going to side with a strong man that brings safety. So Donald Trump won on this.
All right, John, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for giving us some straight talk from Washington. I think if Gavin Newsom presented a gift on a silver platter to Donald Trump, you've presented a gift on a silver platter to us. And that is some cool, balanced analysis. Often the analysis we get of President Trump is on the extreme side, but your analysis is like a cool glass of water. So thank you very much. I think you've made some news today. You've told us about a perception about how the general perception in Washington is of Australia's approach to AUKUS. You've told us that CSIS is supporting Australia's membership of the G7. So thank you for being part of Team Australia there. You also gave us some good advice, and that is don't perform in front of the emperor. Don't put trophies in front of the emperor. Just be true to yourself. Act in your own interests and do the best you can, and that's the best way of you presenting yourself. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation with John Hamre as much as I have, and please join me in thanking John.